As America moved forward in the Gilded Age, African Americans faced dark times in the Jim Crow South. The Jim Crow South referred to Jim Crow laws. These laws enforced segregation. Segregation is the act of separating people based on secondary characteristics and criteria. In the American South, it was separation by race. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation of black and white people in both public and private facilities.
Southern states passed measures to take votes away from blacks. The first such measure was the poll tax. With a poll tax, you had to pay a tax in order to vote. Typically, white voters could afford the poll tax, while black voters were unable to afford it, thus keeping them from voting.
Another measure used to keep blacks from voting was literacy tests. White and black voters had to pass a literacy test in order to prove that they could read before they could vote. Usually, African American voters were given harder tests to guarantee that they would fail. The Gilded Age also gave us one of the most significant Supreme Court case rulings in the history of the United States. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Since the end of the Civil War, the United States Supreme Court had looked the other way on the unconstitutional anti-black laws in the South. In 1896, the Supreme Court decided to hear a case that challenged segregation in the South based on the 14th Amendment, the equal protection under the law regardless of race. In their ruling, the Supreme Court established the principle of separate but equal. Through this principle, the Supreme Court judged that African Americans were not denied their citizenship rights because they were provided the same services as whites, even if those services were provided in a separate setting. For example, no African American in the South could say that they are being denied their citizenship right to education, because although they had to go to separate all-black schools away from whites, they were still being provided an education. Ultimately, the effect of Plessy v. Ferguson is that segregation was ruled legal and constitutional. This ruling ensured that segregation and discrimination in the South would be protected by law in the United States for another 60 years.
The legacy of separate but equal and the Jim Crow South basically creates two Americas, white and black. Southern states continued denying blacks their natural rights, facilitating racial discrimination until the 1950s. This left African Americans unprotected from violent retaliation for resisting discrimination.
With segregation and racial discrimination protected by law, it would be another 50 years before the civil rights movement would be able to correct the wrongs of the Jim Crow South.
Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were two of the most important leaders of the black community during the late 19th and early 20th century, but don't think these leaders worked hand in hand. Like Adams and Jefferson, MLK and Malcolm X, Professor X and Magneto, their ideas were often opposing, if not adversarial to each other. Take Booker T. Washington, born into slavery, freed by the 13th Amendment, initially self-taught. He would go on to co-found the Tuskegee Institute that would train African Americans in agriculture and industry and help promote their economic progress. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, was born after the Civil War in Massachusetts, educated in integrated schools, and would first experience true Jim Crow when he attended the historically black Fisk University in Tennessee. Du Bois went on to publish many works on the current and future state of African Americans and even co-founded the NAACP. So, why do Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois matter? Washington and Du Bois both had their own plans for how blacks should achieve success in America. Washington proposed that African Americans' primary concern should be achieving independence through learning trades. Addressed in what's known as his Atlanta Compromise speech, he urged blacks to postpone battles for equal political rights and instead focus on economic security. While this position might be seen as pragmatic, to many it reeked of accommodation. And W.E.B. Du Bois was certainly in that camp. He felt that the submission to any denial of rights was unacceptable. He felt that civil rights and higher education were uncompromisingly critical to the success of African Americans and spoke of the talented 10th, a small segment of the black population that would lead the way to true political, social, and economic equality.